It is a world of heroes, swords, and magic, the continent of heroes. At this very moment, there is a war of incredible proportions taking place here, involving all nations, races, and species of living beings. This war was started by a demon queen hoping to destroy all living beings and conquer the entire world. Launching their invasion by surprise and with incredible power, the demon army, supported by the power of their queen, was so strong that no one could stop their attacks. They passed through the empires of various races and creatures like a knife through butter, leaving behind only death, ruins, and smoke from burned cities. Mighty warriors, mages, and heroes of various races tried to stop them, but their strength was miserable compared to the demon queen. Very soon, only the human race survived and continued to resist, no matter what. And so the demon queen gathered her army of horrible and repulsive creatures, demons, for the last battle that separated her from dominating this world. But the human empire, due to constant internal quarrels and rebellions, was not fully prepared for the last battle, so after the first defeats, their empire crumbled just like their defense. They helplessly surrendered, forgetting their fallen heroes who stood in their defense. As soon as the human empire fell, the demon queen, by the way, her name was Elizabeth, proclaimed herself as the sole and undisputed ruler of this world. Having covered the whole world with her ominous shadow, she did not want to stop and continued to cherish her evil plans known only to her. Meanwhile, the capital of the human empire is being defeated by an army of demons. Surrounded by the ruins of the once incredible palace and the bodies of the last defenders of this citadel, the High Mage looked at the ruins in despair in the presence of the prince. In the throne room, the High Magician Barrow began to make his last speech, in which he assured that in the future a hero would surely appear who would defeat and destroy the demon Queen Elizabeth, as it was described in ancient legends. He was putting all the despair and rage that he was feeling at what he was seeing around him into it. However, suddenly he fell to the ground from the prince's blow. Taken by surprise by this betrayal, he had no time to do anything. He could only guess at the prince's motives and goals. Prince Vis Malfoy leaned over the defeated teacher and mentor, with a seemingly good-natured face, but his words were pure poison. He said that he should take Her Majesty's orders seriously and that no one was interested in his opinion at all. He was only given orders that he should immediately obey. The Supreme Magus could not even move and only lay helplessly at the traitor's feet. Gathering the remnants of his strength, he shouted in his face everything he thought about him, the traitor of the human race. How he regretted that he had not seen this in him earlier, mistakenly hoped to raise him into the hero promised in ancient legends who would save them from demons. Hearing his words, the prince went mad with rage and, unable to contain his anger, was going to finish the job he had started. The rage and hatred that filled him released his true demonic nature. And when he was about to end it all with words of contempt for his teacher and his father, who had long since died, a voice rang out, a voice of such power that the prince instantly stopped a moment before the end. It was Elizabeth herself. She had other goals for him and death would have been too easy for him to participate in. The prince was forced to stop an inch from his goal. And despite all his desire, he could not finish what he had started. The order of his mistress was so strong. Elizabeth wanted to know more about this prophecy. She wondered if it was really possible that in the future one of these weak and insignificant people would be able to challenge her. It should have been interesting and fun. After all these years of war, she had never met a single opponent worthy of her. However, she did not show it outwardly. She just said with contempt, "Worthless man, you'd better explain what you mean, otherwise." She knows 1,000 ways to make a person suffer a fate worse than death. And looking into those red eyes, there was no doubt about it. Then the frightened magician began to shout that the prophecy said that the promised hero must come and only he could pull the holy sword out of the stone. And the day he pulls the sword out, the power of demons over people will come to an end. This holy sword is stuck in a stone platform in the main hall. But then he stopped and assured her that he would never tell her again. And he would never betray the human race. But it turned out that just one look from Elizabeth was enough for him to give her all the information she needed. And in a moment, the platform with the sword emerged from the secret hiding place. It was the holy sword, Alpha, or the first, the sword of myths and legends, which defeated countless enemies. Looking at it, Elizabeth wondered if this legend was true and if the one who would draw it would really have the power and the right to challenge her. Or maybe it was just another nonsense from pathetic people. However, when she touched the hilt of the sword, she felt its considerable power and potential. Immersed in her thoughts, she walked toward the throne. Out loud she said, "How interesting." As she approached the throne, with a subtle smile and a twinkle in her eye, she said that she would wait here on the throne until the hero arrived. Thus began the reign of the Demon Queen over all the races and peoples of this world. In the first year, countless guards of demons and traitors stood at the gates of her throne room to keep all her subjects in fear and obedience. But after a year, no one dared to rebel, and the guards became fewer. Then even fewer. By the fourth year, only a few guards remained on duty. In the fifth year, no one guarded the queen's throne room at all. Over time, the seemingly cruel rule of the Demon Queen became familiar to the inhabitants of this world, and life and prosperity began to return to cities throughout the continent of heroes. Bustling commerce filled the streets and creatures of all kinds hurried about their business. Demons, elves, beastmen, gnomes, humans, everyone had a place in this world. Under the leadership of the Demon Queen, all past disputes and hostility between the races disappeared. Everyone had equal opportunities and no one had an advantage over others. Without disputes and claims against each other, everyone was finally able to live in peace and harmony with others. Very quickly, the continent of heroes began to prosper and grow rich under the seemingly ruthless rule of the Demon Queen. Because of this, many began to worry and fear the return of the hero, which could destroy the fragile peace. Therefore, an anti-heroic alliance was formed to prevent the return of the promised hero. Elizabeth sat on the throne of the demonic empire, receiving envoys from different races and from remote corners of her empire. The throne room had been restored and was meant to emphasize the queen's power. The only reason for the guests was a single question: so, is there any news of the promised hero? The first to speak are the representatives of the elves and dwarves. Twilia, the chancellor of the elven race, assures them that they have already engaged all the wood insects in the search, but have found absolutely nothing about the promised hero. Heimerdinger, the chancellor of the dwarf race, said that the dwarves are not very good at collecting information, but they have collected information from all the weapon shops, and according to this research there is no one suspicious. Then the representative of the humans, Aristotle, spoke, and he said smugly and proudly that he believed that even if the promised hero did appear, he would not be able to stand up to all of us. We didn't have to worry about him at all. The next to speak was the demon chancellor, Jim, who could hardly hide his anger and immediately said, in response to Aristotle's words, that he might not know because he had only recently joined, but that Her Majesty was not afraid of the promised hero. On the contrary, she really wants him to come. He also whispered that the queen had collected all kinds of ancient books on magic and martial arts to study. At the same time, with a reverent whisper, the Beastman Chancellor added that Her Majesty could destroy the continent of heroes in a matter of seconds. The elf exclaimed that it was all the fault of the idiot Barrows. What prophecy? That's just nonsense. That with Her Majesty they could just let the promised hero die. At the same time, a noise began to come from the doorway, and a clumsy old man entered the room shouting, "Cancel the hero, cancel the hero." Heimerdinger only tiredly noted that as soon as someone starts talking about Barrow, he immediately appears, as in the famous saying. Wearing a loose shirt and pink underpants, Barrow Smith moved around the room, shouting loudly. Once a high magician and priest of the human race, he was now the president of the Demon Queen's fan club and the Association Against the Promised Hero. Once the pride of the human race and a model of behavior and dignity, he had become a henchman and a petty sycophant of the Demon Queen. Just one snap of Elizabeth's fingers and incredible magical power is released from her hand. This stream of magic, like a huge hand, picks up the unfortunate magician and priest, knocking the breath out of him and all the junk he brought with him. Pulling him to her, Elizabeth asks him with a seemingly sweet smile, "Where is the promised hero?" Scared to death, squeezed by an incredible force, he begins to make a lame excuse. That the prophecy might not be accurate or even true at all. Especially if the purpose of the prophecy is not at all what was expected. Like, for example, her unsurpassed majesty. Their sweet conversation was interrupted by the young prince, who said with all his graciousness that the old priest was right. That it was a great insult to believe in this stupid prophecy and apply it to Her Majesty. This unfortunate priest had recently found something that allowed him to say that. But before he could finish, he received a powerful slap from the queen that knocked him out. She didn't even look in his direction and just threw him over her shoulder with contempt. "Get lost, you bum." As soon as he came to his senses, he could only say that he completely agreed with this and realized his pitifulness. The irritated queen called the priest a pile of garbage and threw him across the hall into the wall. With a distinctive sound, he crashed into it halfway through his body, leaving only the edge of his robe and ridiculous pink underwear outside. An expected fate for such a jester. Elizabeth, with a determined expression on her face and straightening up to her full height, began to say that she was the ruler of everything and had reached the top of this world. She held the power of the whole world in her hands. She is waiting for a legendary hero who will be able to challenge her and will finally be able to entertain her. And then he will be just a stepping stone to her even greater glory. She studied all the ancient magic books of the hero continent and after endless attempts was able to create doomsday magic to be ready for the hero's test. And she began to approach the sword she had been contemplating for the past 15 years. The sword, like Excalibur, was illuminated by the rays of the sun, exquisitely decorated with gold and precious stones. The queen continued to approach the sword wondering, why is the hero nowhere to be seen, where is he? She continued to stare at the sword with concentration. And there it was at arm's length, so shiny and beautiful and at the same time powerful and deadly. So, since the hero does not go to Elizabeth, she will come to him. And she took the hilt of the sword with a stone expression full of determination that her subjects had not seen for a long time. As soon as everyone in the room realized what their queen was going to do, they were filled with fear and bewilderment. They all wondered how she dared to do this. They immediately started shouting at her to stop. But their opinion was worthless to her, so she gripped the hilt of her sword with all her strength and tenacity. And with the words, "I am coming to you," she began to pull it. The whole hall was filled with flashes of energy coming from the queen. But even with such power she could not do it all at once, but she continued to pull with all the strength she had. Sweat began to drip down her terrible and beautiful face. The expression of maximum tension was frozen on her face. It was a scary and dangerous sight. The wind and lightning of pure energy began to demolish everything around. None of those present in the throne room could stand on their feet, and only the timely reaction of the demon chancellor saved the others from danger. He created magical shields that protected everyone else, except for the talentless priest, who was flying around the hall with a part of the wall. There was no limit to their amazement, would the demon queen pull out the holy sword. A whirlwind of incredible energy pierced the ceiling of the palace like paper and flew into the sky. What could have caused this? Finally, the demon queen drew the holy sword, and when the smoke cleared, Elizabeth appeared before everyone, sword in hand. With a mockery she asked, who said that only a legendary hero could pull out this sword? She was about to throw it away as another piece of trash, when suddenly, images of the countryside began to appear before her eyes, mountains, a valley, and then a lonely house. It was not very clear, but it was enough for her to realize where the legendary promised hero was hiding. With the satisfied smile of a predator who has stalked its prey, Elizabeth said, "Yes, this is where you are hiding." Raising her hand, she began to prepare a spell of displacement. And now, enveloped in the glow of symbols and words in an ancient and long-forgotten language, she was going to arrive immediately at that unfortunate hero. The sycophantic prince tried to go with the queen, asking her to allow him to continue serving her. And when he almost reached her, with a puff of smoke, the queen disappeared, leaving only one bright red hair in his hand. He could only breathe out, "My teacher, Elizabeth." And he remained standing there, confused, with his hand outstretched. Meanwhile, in the village of newcomers, in a valley among the impregnable mountains, somewhere on the outskirts of the continent of heroes, A young peasant is working hard in the field under the scorching sun. Even a large straw hat does not help him escape the heat, and he is forced to wipe the sweat from his face with a handkerchief. This is the legendary hero. He works quietly in the field and is completely satisfied with his life. He does not even realize what fate awaits him ahead. Let's take a closer look at his story. It turns out that he is not from this world. His name is Li Ping, and he was an ordinary office worker. He lived an ordinary and boring life, didn't like to play games or watch anime. His only pleasure was watching his favorite short videos on his way to work on public transportation. These were short videos about farming. They talked about different tips for fertilizing the soil for different types of plants, as well as processing the harvested crops into ready-to-eat meals. He also liked videos about animal care. In other words, he loved everything about agriculture and such a simple, carefree life. He was so jealous of those who made these videos. He wanted to live the same life so badly. He had dreamed about it so many times, but one day something was different. Suddenly, everything around him disappeared, and only the strap of the transport remained in his hand. A new world was already surrounding him, with a flock of dragons in the air, flying majestically by. Different air, different sky, different mountains, everything new. And then Lee realized that this was not a dream, not a vision. He was frightened and confused. How could this have happened to him? As time went on, under the guidance of the novice system, he slowly learned the basic skills of survival in this world. In fact, at first he knew nothing about this completely different world, but it did not scare him at all. After all, this was the simple farming life he wanted so much. Lee felt his strength and health had improved compared to his life in the previous world. However, after a while, an information window appeared with the following message: "Dear player, after this period of rookie training, you have fully fulfilled the conditions necessary to leave the rookie village. Please start your adventure." But our hero was so pleased with how things were going that he wondered why he had to leave. He was so happy here, what else did he need for a happy life? Then the next message appeared, emphasizing that after he leaves the newcomer village, he will meet all kinds of people and creatures in this world. He would be able to learn a variety of sword and magic skills, and perhaps become a legendary hero who could defeat the demon queen who had taken over the world. And then he was asked to start the adventure again. But the hero did not give up easily and still did not want to start the adventure. He explained that he did not want to kill any demon queen. He insisted that he just wanted to continue living here in the village of newcomers. The information windows began to bother him more and more, urging him to leave the newcomer village. They asked him to go fulfill his mission to kill the demon king and start his adventure. Then they began to convince him that the later he left the newbie village, the stronger the demon king would be. That learning sword and magic skills would allow the legendary hero to get treasures and all kinds of interesting encounters. Then the system simply required him to start the adventure. Over and over again. The system kept telling him to leave the newbie village and start the adventure, but it seemed that there was nothing the system could do to him except give him messages and couldn't force him to leave. Lee decided that he could go to hell with this demon king. He just wanted to stay here and live like this forever. There is something that makes the newcomer village special. It's a special time barrier that completely hides the newbie village and keeps it safe. Inside this barrier, one day lasts much longer than 24 hours. And this allows you to do much more inside the barrier than outside it. Our hero Li Ping used this time to hone his farming skills to perfection. He gained a lot of experience and increased his physical strength. He also went hunting in the forest, where he became a master of archery and agile movement. He learned to be as quiet and invisible as a shadow. He became a master at making objects. He spent a lot of time in meditation and reflection, increasing his spiritual power. He still didn't know anything about swords and magic, but it didn't matter to him because he wasn't going out on an adventure. He traded the points he got from the newbie tasks to slowly build his perfect house out of junk. This went on until one day, when suddenly, the barrier surrounding the village exploded, leaving one last angry message for Lee: "How stupid, in this world of sword and magic, where you can do whatever you want and become whatever you want. All you do every day is farm, completely ignoring my advice. You're not a legendary hero at all. You only know how to get newbie points and exchange them for maintenance tools. You don't want to learn any skills with a sword or magic at all. You're not interested in my adventure help features at all. I hate it. I hate you. I hope you die soon by the hand of the Demon King. The system disappeared, leaving no trace behind. Our hero just exhaled a sigh of relief. He thought that finally there would be no more annoying notifications. And everyone would leave him alone. After a hard day's work in the field, he felt hungry and decided to make himself dinner. But he noticed that he was running out of firewood and decided to chop some more. As he approached the log to chop the wood, he remembered that he hadn't brought his special axe with him. He had left it in the woods when he chopped wood in the morning. Suddenly, the sky was covered with clouds and countless lightning bolts appeared among them. A strong wind rose. Lee looked up, not understanding what was happening. It was the first time he had ever seen anything like this. Frightened and confused, he said, "Not now." Elizabeth appeared from the sky, surrounded by lightning. It was a spectacular appearance. Satisfied that she had finally found this unfortunate legendary hero, she smiled to herself, hoping for fun ahead. But all her hopes were dashed in a moment and she looked in amazement at what was happening on the ground. Our legendary hero ran as fast as he could to his house. But the reason for this was not Elizabeth, whom he did not even notice, but the clouds with rain that Lee noticed, and he was worried about his belongings and fish that were drying in the open air. Elizabeth could only guess why he was running. Is he really the legendary hero promised in the prophecies? Why is he so insignificant? Lee breathed a sigh of relief, glad to have managed to save his belongings and dried fish and sausages from the rain. His robodog companion, Wonkai, was not as calm and happy as his master. He started barking at the clouds, anticipating trouble. But Lee did not understand what was happening at all. He thought his dog was afraid of the rain and thunderstorm. He began to calm him down, trying to explain to him that it was about to rain and they had to go home. But Wonkai would not calm down. And when Lee was about to leave him here and go inside himself, the dog began to disturb him and bark at him. Then even our stiff-necked man began to realize that something was wrong. And he finally looked up at the sky. Finally, he saw a strange silhouette against the clouds. It was strangely shaped. And Lee asked his robot dog what that thing was in the sky. The dog kept barking. Elizabeth looked at Lee as if he were a complete idiot. How could he be so stupid as to compare her to anything? As soon as Lee heard her voice, he immediately began to apologize for not seeing her clearly earlier. However, he was overwhelmed with questions that he couldn't say out loud. Why would someone out of the blue want to join? Shouldn't a village of newcomers be completely safe? Elizabeth said with a murderous look on her face, "Let's check it out first." She began to prepare a spell. Before Lee could even ask what she was talking about, an object was rapidly flying at him. All he could do was to shield himself with his hand from imminent death, but Elizabeth was surprised. The fact that he remained alive and unharmed was promising. Instead of piercing him, the sword began to make a circle around him. And then it lay right in his hand, ready to fight. Lee was as shocked as Elizabeth. How did he do that? He immediately struck a heroic pose and swung his sword. But it was all instinctive. As soon as he realized what was happening, he immediately began to try to throw away the sword, which flew into his hand. Lee was stunned and frightened by what was happening. Elizabeth stated that the recognition of the Holy Sword Alpha could not be wrong. She had finally found the legendary hero. But something was wrong with him. His magical powers were so low that even the ordinary soldiers in her army were outclassed by him. Could he be hiding his true power? This was an unanswered question. Then she introduced herself to Lee, said that her name was Elizabeth and she was the strongest demon queen in history. Today she would completely destroy the last legendary hero. She began to cast a spell of incredible power to destroy this pitiful hero in one attack. And then Lee, scared to death, began to ask himself why the Demon Queen was here. He hadn't left this place. At the same time, his faithful robodog started barking at the Demon Queen again. Scared even more, Lee tried to calm him down, as he thought he might provoke Elizabeth. With the help of the abyssal magic, the Demon Queen should have simply destroyed this place. 3 huge icons appeared in the sky. Huge meteors began to appear from them, about to destroy everything below. The frightened Lee finally began to realize that perhaps the system was telling him that his meeting with the Demon Queen was inevitable, even if he didn't leave the newbie village. Then Lee simply threw his sword on the ground and said that he had nothing more to say here then. He just started running to his house without even trying to do anything else. His reasoning was as follows: so I'm a rookie nub, but the final boss has come to my door, so what can I do but accept my fate? And he headed for his door without a care in the world, leaving his faithful dog, the robot, to take care of business. As he stood at the door, Lee reflected that perhaps he should even be grateful for this fate. As he entered the house, he knew he had nothing to regret. He had spent so much happy time here. In the end, he just wanted to go back to zero with this house. And he just locked himself in his house waiting for the fate that Elizabeth had in store for him. The Demon Queen did not understand at all what was going on. Why did he drop his weapon? Why didn't he run away? Why did he lock himself in the house? And what did his stupid smile mean in the end? Was it an ambush from him and he was so strong that he was not afraid of her at all? These thoughts drove Elizabeth crazy. She screamed that he was an incredibly sneaky bastard. She was angrier than ever before. How could it be that someone could turn his back on her like that with a smile on his face? She shouted, "Die," and directed the full power of her magic at this house. Giant stone meteors flew at the little house and nothing seemed to stop them. The robot dog went into combat mode. He began to measure and calculate the strength of the attack in order to respond with enough force to repel it. The 3 giant meteors were flying very fast under the influence of gravity and pushed by the power of magic and seemed to be blurred spots. But Wonkai had completed his calculations in time and was ready to respond. Combat modules with missiles began to transform from its robotic body. And within a second, the robot was fully in combat mode. It was armed with dozens of missiles and other countermeasures to counter threats. It opened fire with all the weapons it had, and thanks to the calculations made, each of its shells hit the target. The first attack was repelled by the efforts of the robot's faithful dog. Elizabeth liked what she saw. The hero from the legends was not so helpless after all. He had such an advanced magic tool in the form of this robotic dog. It must be a legendary battle. But compared to it, this dog was absolutely nothing. And she was going to prove it in battle. She began to prepare an even more powerful spell again. With the help of apocalyptic magic, she was going to destroy this whole piece of the continent. She told the dog that she had lost interest in testing its capabilities and was going to end it here and now. She summoned an incredibly large meteor of pure energy. Wonkai started his calculations again. And as soon as he completed them, he got ready to act. He began to generate a small black hole. Wonkai enlarged it to a certain point. And then he launched it into a huge energy meteor. The Demon Queen saw his attempt, but she was sure that he would not succeed. And so the little black hole of the robot dog fell into this energy bowl. Elizabeth smiled to herself, confident that they would be destroyed along with a piece of this earth. But something was wrong. Suddenly, the energy ball began to dissipate without reaching its goal. And then it disappeared without a trace, causing no harm. The Demon Queen was shocked. Her apocalyptic magic hadn't worked. How could this be? She did not understand what had happened. Her magic was broken. This had never happened before. But one more question was on her mind. What was the hero doing inside the house? She could not even imagine it. And he was just lying in bed, ready to accept his death, imagining all the happy moments that had been in his life. Surprised, Elizabeth began to descend to the ground. Wonkai continued to bark at her. Elizabeth looked at the robotic dog with curiosity. She wondered what kind of creature he was. Wong Kai was ready for a fight and had the right expression on his face. After a moment of hesitation and reflection, Elizabeth laughed. It was unexpected, but in the end it was she who underestimated her opponent. How ironic. She had decided to finish the job manually, without the help of magic, just using the unreal physical strength she had. Elizabeth spread her wings in preparation for hand-to-hand combat. As she approached the robot dog, she shouted at it not to be too proud of itself, because it had used less than 30% of its strength before. In her true terrifying form, she came at him like a ball of death and fear. The queen was sure that she could show him what real terror was. The poor, frightened dog had no choice but to stay and fight her. A battle of incredible intensity was taking place in the yard of the small house. Meanwhile, our hero had been sleeping peacefully for an hour. He woke up and didn't quite understand what had happened. Was he dead or not? He looked around and he was still in his house. Lee was surprised by this turn of events. He got out of bed not believing that he had real ground under his feet. Everything seemed so normal, except for one thing. There was an extraordinary silence outside the house. Lee decided to check it out. He went to the door, grabbed the handle and froze. A crazy thought froze his movements. What if this demon queen was waiting for him outside the door like a maniac? He cautiously peered out of the door with fear. Before him was a battlefield, a battle that had just ended. Clouds of dust were everywhere, but they were already beginning to clear. As the dust settled, Lee saw Elizabeth holding a mangled Wong Kai. Her claws were crushing his limp head. Lee only managed to shout the name of his faithful friend, while the demon queen finally broke the robot dog. Then Elizabeth threw away the broken robot and went to Lee. With mock regret, she told him how sorry she was that she had completely destroyed his magical tool, which he was so proud of. As always, the frightened Lee tried to reassure her, assuring her that it was nothing to worry about, that she had broken his robot, asking her to calm down and sit down to talk. Elizabeth was very tired and she angrily told him that of course they would sit down to talk, but only after she had killed him. Elizabeth couldn't believe it. Was that really it? She was already at the end of her rope and could barely hold on. She was shaking with tension and exhaustion. Was this really the end for her that was foretold in the prophecy? What a humiliation to lose to such a worthless hero who did not even come out to fight her. And without taking a few steps, she fell down exhausted. The seemingly impossible had happened. The invincible demon queen who had held the entire continent of heroes in her steel grip now lay helpless and defeated on a lawn in the middle of a village of newcomers. It seemed like an ignominious end, but Lee overcame his fear and curiously asked Elizabeth what had happened to her. He could not even imagine the trouble he had escaped. He went to her and gently and carefully lifted her by the shoulders. Lee asked if she was alive while holding her. However, he never received an answer. Something unusual began to happen to Elizabeth. Her demonic horns and wings began to disappear and melt away as if they had never been there. And since all her armor was demonic armor, supported by her power, it also began to disappear. Lee did not understand what she was trying to do or whether she was doing it on purpose. Her clothes were steadily disappearing. And when there was nothing left, it was quite a sight. It made Lee lose his temper and a good half a liter of blood. But in the end, he tamed himself. After all, night was coming, and on the continent of heroes, nights are dangerous and cold, and it is better to spend them in the house than outside. Morning came and the clock was already showing 9:30 in the morning. And Elizabeth was still in bed. Although Lee was not the smartest guy in the village, he still thought of putting shackles on his unexpected guest to protect himself from unexpected events. Elizabeth finally woke up, and her surprise knew no bounds. Why is she still alive? She was a demon queen who had kept the whole world in fear and had never known defeat before, and now she was experiencing a humiliating and painful defeat. The first one in her life. She wondered why, instead of using the opportunity to kill her, he had imprisoned her. Why did he do it? To show his power to the whole world? Or did he have other motives? She was completely confused and no longer understood this strange hero. But she had to do something about it. She began to gather her strength to break the shackles. She gathered all the strength she had left for a decisive breakthrough, and nothing, absolutely nothing happened. And the shackles remained on her hands. She looked at them sadly. Again, an artifact of a legendary class that she had never seen before. She was disappointed with everything that had happened to her. Damn it, she had underestimated him. How much power he was hiding and how much more he had. If only she knew. She began to look around the room that surrounded her. It was filled with objects she had never seen before. A chess knight, a Pokemon, a deck of cards. She continued to think that these strange things could not be simple. It seems that this hero is much more evil and dangerous than she had imagined. She had underestimated him very much. Immersed in her thoughts, she did not notice how time passed. Lee came in the door. With a sweet smile, he tried to show his peaceful intentions. He asked Elizabeth if she was awake yet. He had a plan. Elizabeth was very wary. She met him assuring him that if he wanted to kill her, he should not expect her to beg for mercy. At the same time, Lee was thinking that the Demon Queen is really scary, but this is his only chance for survival. He just had to use it. Lee asked her if she would rather talk instead of killing. Then he noticed the shackles on her hands. Offering her food, he justified why he had shackled her. Only as a precautionary measure, because she looked so scary and he could not help himself. Then he would justify himself because she might have misunderstood him and he didn't mean it, and she was not scary at all, but formidable looking. Elizabeth had no idea what he was talking about. She just looked at him questioningly. Confused, Lee assured her that it was a misunderstanding between them. He would unlock the shackles for her right away and they could talk calmly and without tension. Meanwhile, from Elizabeth's perspective, things looked like this. She thought Lee was cunning and insidious. He pretended to be sorry for the misunderstanding at the beginning. And he thought it was funny that she thought she could be worthy of challenging a hero. She felt that if she wanted to survive, she had to do everything he told her, otherwise he would destroy her. She looked at him, wondering how he could dare to threaten the Demon Queen. Lee went over and unlocked her shackles. He hoped that by unlocking her shackles, he had proved that he had no bad or sick intentions. Elizabeth thought to herself that this situation was very unfavorable for her. However, strong personalities know when to obey and when to stand your ground. She decided to obey him now. But she planned to make him pay and regret his arrogance later. Lee didn't understand what was happening, so he simply told her to rest and went to the corner of the room, scared. Having time to think, Lee reasoned that everyone would probably wonder why he didn't kill the Demon Queen when she was unconscious. After all, in this world of swords and magic, it is completely normal for her, as a Demon Queen, to have the possibility of resurrection. Killing chickens and fish for soup is one thing, but how could he kill a person? However, in his mind, resolving the conflict between the hero and the Demon Queen doesn't necessarily require a battle and killing. As long as he can, he will not pose any threat to her and will become a friend to her. And they can continue to live happily ever after. Distracted, he began to get visibly excited about his plans, which Elizabeth interpreted as another mockery of her. Lee noticed the mangled remains of his faithful friend on the table. He sadly told him what a mess he had become. Elizabeth was still sitting on the bed, trying to act as submissive as she could. When she saw Lee holding his mutilated robot, she asked him if it was his strongest magical weapon. She expected that it was his strongest tool, and that the fact that she had destroyed it would not allow him to create a new one. And she should just wait for the right moment to take revenge. Lee replied that it wasn't really a magic tool, it was just a small thing he made when he lived here. He made it just because he was bored. And he made it recently. Elizabeth heard what she wanted and understood everything in her own way. She had already started dreaming about what she would do with this hero. He will dream of death, but it will be an unfulfilled dream for him. This time, he will be the one who will be helpless without his magic tricks. She, on the other hand, without handcuffs, can use the magic of the abyss to quickly regain her lost strength. Now she thought that he had lost the protection of his strongest magical tool. It was just like losing his right arm. The balance of power was now on her side. Elizabeth was about to start her plan, but she only said out loud that she was sorry for the things she had broken. Lee did not even turn to her and did not see what was happening behind him. He was carelessly removing the memory card from Wonkai. He assured Elizabeth that everything was fine and that it was not a big deal that she had broken his robot because the memory card had survived. Elizabeth decided that this was the best moment to destroy this legendary hero. She had already started to gather forces for the attack. And Lee, unsuspectingly, said that the body could be repaired. And he quickly opened a drawer with 6 brand new disabled robots that he had made before, so she shouldn't worry. He had everything under control. And he smiled, glad that he hadn't upset his guest as much as he thought he had. Shocked and disappointed, Elizabeth didn't understand how this was possible. She had barely managed to defeat 1 robot, and now there were 6 more. It made her feel like giving up. Lee, meanwhile, took one of the robots off the shelf without noticing anything. He inserted a memory card and turned it on. Wonkai came back to life. Lee began to tell Elizabeth that it was fun to have a companion. However, he is sometimes naughty, so he usually only turns him on at home. Meanwhile, Wonkai was happy to be back and jumped around his owner. From Elizabeth's point of view, Lee's carefree conversation was full of mockery and threats. And this angry robot did not give her peace of mind. She sat down powerlessly on the bed. It just couldn't be. Elizabeth was scared and didn't know what to do. All her previous plans had been destroyed. There was no way she could defeat so many of these robots. She was in despair. Then a smell came to her, an incredible smell. She had never smelled anything like it before. She put aside and forgot all her sad thoughts and asked Lee what it was. As a demon, she was used to the smell of smoke, blood, death, and corpses. But this smell was new and pleasant to her. Lee said that when she fainted, he decided to cook her some food to warm her up. He thought she would definitely be hungry. So he decided to be proactive. He put a bowl of plain porridge with meat and plain dumplings in front of her. They looked very good and smelled very good too. Elizabeth looked at the food and said that only weaklings need food to exist. She had long ago reached a transcendental state where she no longer needed such things as food. However, the sight and smell of the food Lee had prepared for her left her no chance. She began to realize that she could not resist this overwhelming desire. Elizabeth could no longer look away. All her attention was focused on the food. She began to swallow her drool. She could not resist. And now her stomach began to growl. She was ashamed of her weakness before her sworn enemy. She asked herself how she could have stooped so low. Lee was sure that resolving conflicts with delicious food was going to work. He said that he had prepared it all from vegetables and grains that he had grown himself, all completely natural. He invited Elizabeth to try it. She took the fork with distrust and reached for the tempting dumplings. Not knowing what awaited her. Was this food poisoned or not? Elizabeth had her doubts. She finally made up her mind and brought the first dumpling to her lips. She took the first bite. But she didn't make a face. Then another one. There was absolutely nothing on her face. It was not at all clear whether she liked it or not. Lee was confident in his cooking skills and the food he had prepared. But he wondered if it would be enough for a demon queen of her status. Would she appreciate a rookie village-level meal? He was very worried about whether she would like it. Although Elizabeth did not show any emotion, the fork spoke for her and the dumplings disappeared from the plate one by one. And then she put the last dumpling in her mouth. And she beamed with pleasure. With every bite, the juicy meat filling exploded like fireworks in her mouth. The natural and tasty ingredients from which the dumplings were made also had a high concentration of magical energy. She could feel it. She was more satisfied than ever before. Elizabeth began to realize that in fact there are many pleasant things in this world. It is so delicious that even she, the demon queen, cannot endure and not swallow this last bite. Incredible feelings of pleasure and bliss filled her. And she could not delay this moment any longer. She swallowed the last bite. But something was wrong. She felt it immediately. What was it? A burning and searing sensation filled her after the last piece of dumpling. Tears began to appear in her eyes. Even her heart felt it and began to beat incredibly fast. It was as if a volcano of flavor and fire had exploded inside her. She could not hold back her exclamation. The dumplings were so spicy that she could not bear it, but they were so delicious, and at first she did not feel the bitterness at all. But then, the fire was scorching like hell. Barely able to hold herself together, Elizabeth asked what he had put in her food. Lee was shocked. He said that he had added a little chili to his own taste. Doesn't she, the demon queen, like spicy food? Elizabeth could hardly breathe and realized that he did not have good intentions. And this evil hero had imprisoned her only to conduct his sick experiments. However, Lee had his own view of the events and a ready-made solution to the problem. He told her he had a solution. Let her just try his specialty porridge. With a smile, he first told her about the composition of the porridge. He added eggs and lean pork to it. Lee was sure that the porridge would reduce the heat and calm the fire in her mouth. Elizabeth looked at him with distrust and anger. What a cunning scoundrel he is. First feeding her poison with one hand and then offering her the antidote with the other. She thought he was playing with her with one palm. There is no sane explanation for this. It was all very strange. She felt very uncomfortable, but she couldn't ignore the fire burning in her mouth. She picked up a spoon and scooped up some porridge. She brought it to her mouth to savor the flavor before tasting it. And finally she tasted it. She didn't even realize what she was feeling at first. However, in a moment she was already in seventh heaven with happiness. This incredible contrast of flavor filled her, tore her apart, and then put her back together again. It was incredible. She felt as if she were a shining angel. Tears of happiness and pleasure began to drip from her eyes. Eyes that had never cried before. It was so beautiful. These feelings filled her so much that she felt so peaceful and cozy. Endless comfort filled her. She could not and did not want to stop on this path. These feelings completely changed her, every molecule of her body and mind. Now the task of world domination and enslavement of everyone, the struggle between the demon queen and the hero. All this no longer made any sense to her and did not bother her at all. It seemed that all her problems, suffering, anger, and hatred were disappearing. She was letting go of all that negative stuff and was going to live a carefree life. But it was all because she realized how insignificant she is, like a grain of sand on a huge beach. How small she was compared to the universe she had discovered. Elizabeth sat there filled with wisdom and knowledge. She was now a demon queen of a whole new level. Unbelievably, she had entered a new dimension through the consumption of food. Under the influence of two extreme stimuli, her powers had increased several times. She could feel it. Elizabeth sat on the bed and looked at Lee carefully. She told him not to pretend and asked him what he really wanted. She had a lot of suspicions about him. Lee asked her simply and with a smile what she thought. Would they be able to conduct an experiment together to find out if it was possible for a hero and a demon queen to coexist peacefully? On Elizabeth's part, she thought that she had realized his true intentions. He is a sick, evil hero. He threatens her that she is the only one in this world worthy of being the object of his research. He will help her become stronger so that she can defeat him. She thought that he was going to play with her like an experimental doll. Lee did not understand what was happening to her expression. He asked if she would mind if he continued to cook her delicious meals. Elizabeth was furious. She thought it was better to die than to be ashamed. She was the queen of demons. She could not allow this. How dare he mock her and tell her that he would help her become stronger if she wanted to, and then wait for her to try to defeat him. What a sick maniac. However, having overcome all her fantasies, she calmly exhaled and said to him out loud, "Forget it." Lee did not understand what had happened. Was she still going to kill him? He was scared. Everything was not going exactly according to plan. He stood there not knowing what was happening, and Elizabeth started to get up on the bed, which raised even more questions. Then she stood up on the bed and looked down at him and said, "Listen to me." As if he had any other choice. She told him that she could agree to his terms, but he should know that she was not doing this out of fear, but out of a desire to reach the pinnacle of power. Lee was completely lost in what was happening. He wondered why she should be afraid. To be afraid of him. But she was the demon queen, she had the power to do whatever she wanted. Something was wrong here, and he didn't understand what it was. Lee wondered how he could understand this strange creature. Elizabeth continued to rage and assure him not to think that she would bow her head and be submissive to him while living here. Her honor as the queen of demons must never be humiliated. With a frightening expression on her face, she continued to warn him that if he disobeyed her, she would make him pay and destroy him, even if she had to sacrifice everything to do so. Lee just gave up in his futile attempts to understand everything. He said that he understood everything. He just wants to try to get along with her. But the look in Elizabeth's eyes made it clear that she did not believe him and was not going to trust him. She began to shout at him that if he wanted to explore, he should feel free to come and try. Poor Lee could only throw his hands up in surrender. And Elizabeth added that if there was anything else delicious, she wanted it all. The weak-willed Lee simply replied that he was a slave and understood. And the legendary Alpha sword was simply abandoned and stuck out of the firewood log. What a spineless hero he turned out to be this time. So a year passed. Lee chopped wood with the legendary sword, log after log. He had already chopped quite a pile. Meanwhile, he was thinking. What should he do? Things had become quite complicated over the past year. Lee remembered that since the Demon Queen had violently entered the newcomer village, she had broken the village's protected barrier. Therefore, time here gradually synchronized with the outside world. Time synchronization is not the problem. The problem is that without the protection of the barrier, the beginner's village lost its main function altogether. It was now completely open and vulnerable to the wildness that surrounded it. And monsters he had never seen before began to appear nearby. Lee continued to chop wood. And piling them up. He continued to think that there were advantages to having a demon queen in his house. It kept the monsters away. But the question remained, what would happen when she left? How would he survive then? He was interrupted by Elizabeth's shout from her room, emphasizing that it was lunchtime. Why wasn't he ready yet? Lee quickly replied that he was on his way and would be ready in a minute. What a wife for a hero. Lee realized that he had no choice. Elizabeth's presence was the key to his safety, so he had to keep her as long as possible. However, over the year, Elizabeth had changed a bit. And there was a reason for that. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was lying on the couch in front of the TV, eating her sixth bag of chips in a row. She was completely out of shape. The delicious food and the TV had done their job, and together they had defeated more heroes in all worlds and dimensions than Elizabeth could have imagined. Covered in crumbs, Elizabeth did not stop. She didn't quite like the shows on TV, so she asked Lee if he could connect her to a new channel. Lee was just carrying the finished dish from the kitchen. Dinner was almost ready. He replied that after the system went down, only this channel was working and there was nothing he could do about it. Lunch was almost ready. Dissatisfied, Elizabeth began to get up from the couch, which began to creak under her considerable weight. She asked Lee to wait for her. But instead of getting to her feet, she began to prepare a spell. Small demonic wings began to form in flashes of pink fire. And then they attached themselves to Elizabeth's back. Instead of going to the kitchen, she simply conjured up the wings and used them to fly to the table and continue eating her chips. As she flew by Lee, she asked what kind of poison these potato chips were. It seems to her that the more she eats them, the lazier she becomes. She thought that under the guise of delicious food he was feeding her poison to make her weak. Lee just tiredly told her that potato chips are very high in calories, and together with the other food she eats too much of, they make her fat. He was so tired, first he chopped wood all morning, then he ran right away to make dinner. Elizabeth asked him again, "Fat? What is fat?" She began to look at her swollen tummy. Then she began to check it with her hand. Indeed, the folds were quite large. But she already knew the solution. She started to spell again. And under the influence of her magic, she began to lose the fat she had accumulated over the past year. Lee just watched in amazement from the sidelines. She was magically able to turn all the fat from a negative attribute into an incredible amount of magical power that was now overwhelming her. Elizabeth acted as if nothing had happened, simply telling Lee that she had turned all the fat into magical power. Lee's eyes just went square. She could use her magic after all. They sat down to lunch together. Elizabeth was very pleased, and she asked Lee how he felt about her dispelling another one of his tricks. Lee already knew what to say, so he just agreed with everything, laughed and invited her to start the meal. Elizabeth was very happy. She liked what she saw on the table. She adored the dishes that Lee prepared. And she thankfully said, "Lee, that today's dinner is incredible." And she began to devour everything on the table with incredible speed. Lee only had time to ask her to take her time. He tiredly said that if she didn't have enough, he would just cook more. Lunch is not a competition to see who can eat the most. And he thought how tiring it was, living with an insatiable devil. Elizabeth saw things differently and wondered what he meant when he asked her to eat more slowly. It seemed to her that he was mocking her, as if she were a pig not eating fast enough and slowly gaining strength for the upcoming battle with him. While Lee was about to bring dessert, she slammed the table with indignation. She shouted that enough is enough. She is fed up with this ridicule. She will not tolerate him treating her like a pig. She had already planned to fight him 10 times this year, but this time she was serious. She was full of energy now and was going to fight to the death. But Lee pulled out a dessert from the fridge, strawberry pudding, Elizabeth's favorite dessert. And she forgot about all the anger she had a moment ago. This perfect pudding was all that mattered to her now. And she agreed to postpone their fight until later. She told Lee to give the pudding to her as soon as possible. Lee thought that luckily this demon was easy to take care of. As long as he cooks her a delicious meal, he can calm her down at any time. This was definitely a plus for him. Meanwhile, somewhere far away from the hero's house, a battle was taking place. An old warrior and a girl were running away from several ghosts that were chasing them. The ghosts were wearing masks and hooded cloaks. They were catching up with their victims. One of them jumped on the old warrior first. He said a spell. Black lightning flew at the fugitives. And when they had almost caught up with them, the ghost said something else and stuck his hand into the black lightning rift. A cage of black lightning surrounded the fugitives. They could no longer run away. Here they had to accept their possibly last battle with these ghosts. The girl's father realized that the two of them couldn't get out and run away from these monsters, so he was determined to sacrifice himself for his daughter. He knew he had no chance of winning, but he could buy her some precious time to escape. His daughter's name was Evil, and he asked her with all his determination to keep running to the city where it would be safe while he held back the monsters. But Evil understood the lengths her father was going to for her and didn't want to leave him here to perish. So she tearfully answered him that she couldn't leave him behind and run away herself. Her father insisted, and tried to persuade her. He asked her to obey him, for it was the only way for her to escape. And he had promised her mother before they parted that he would protect his daughter at all costs, and now it was time to pay that price. One of their pursuers, who was a ghost or a demon or some other monster, managed to prepare his spell, Ghost Fire, while the father was trying to convince his disobedient daughter to run away. However, the ghost didn't have time to use it, as the father had something to answer with a powerful shout that since Evil doesn't want to run away, then they should end it all quickly and use his strongest abilities to do so. He swung his huge sword with a wave of energy that went straight into the ghost's spell. Father put all his strength and desperation into this blow, hoping that he could change their situation. And it looked like he had succeeded. because his blow not only cut and destroyed the ghost fire, but also cut the ghost that had created the spell in half. It seemed that this was their chance to not only survive, but to win. After all, there were still only a few ghosts left to destroy. But with the ghosts falling down and being chopped in two, something was wrong and some kind of blue smoke or energy was vaporizing off of them. It looked as if the ghost's body was just a vessel. Once it was destroyed, the contents spewed out. His destruction was noticed by the other ghost, who, although surprised by this turn of events, seemed to have a plan of action for such an eventuality. For the next moment he stretched out his arm in the direction of the falling remains, and they began to be drawn into him like a stream. And the remains were not just pulled into him, but turned him into a boiling and swelling mass, and it seems that even for the ghost this process was incredibly painful, and he let out a scream that was not understandable for mortals. When the scouring was complete, a monster with arms and legs of darkness and two masks on its head with a toothy mouth finally appeared. Evil at this time did not sit idly by and decided to go on the attack with her bow and arrows of energy. She answered her father that no matter what happened she would never leave him alone. Her skill was called Natural Arrow, and her arrow released from her bow in flight turned into several different arrows that flew towards the target on different trajectories. She was aiming at the third ghost, who still hadn't taken part in the battle. However, as it turned out, Evil's arrows couldn't do him any harm and were simply absorbed by his cloak. Her father saw the result of his daughter's attack and told her that there was no way she would be able to deal with the apostles of the Dark Guild, and he didn't know how long he could hold them off, so he once again asked her to leave and hurry up. The ghost who had fended off the arrow attack suddenly prepared for a low start, and from beneath his robe showed his muscular arms, which he used to drive into the ground. His leap was quick, strong, and swift, and so swift that the ground where he pushed off cracked and exploded as if something had exploded there. In a moment he was at his father's side and brought his fist up to strike. He barely had time to raise his sword in defense. But it did not help him at all, because the blow was so strong that it flew far across the field and half of his sword was still in place. His father flew across the field until his back hit a huge rock, which almost collapsed from such a powerful blow. It was a very painful landing for the father, and he expectorated blood from the impact. Evil, seeing what happened to her father, cried out in horror. He was still clutching the broken sword in his hand, and despite his wounds told her not to worry about him and instead to get out of here faster. There was also something else going on with the ghosts. After the attack, the last ghost jumped on the two-headed monster, and they all started to melt together, about merging into one big ugly monster. Their combined monster was gigantic, and its arms burned with turquoise flames as it slowly approached the two fugitives with a roar that seemed to have no hope of escape. Evil supported her wounded father and looked up at the monster with horror. She assured her father that she would definitely come home with him. He just needed to hold on. But she didn't believe in her own words and just wanted to comfort her dying father. The monster was becoming more and more of an ugly boiling mass with each passing second as it let out horrifying screams and came closer and closer to its victims. Evil looked up in horror and realized that these were her last moments in life and was already ready to die. The monster raised his flaming hand above them for a blow and was about to finish what he had started as suddenly. You know what they say, for every big fish there's always a bigger fish, and that's what happened here. A colossal foot like a giant column collapsed on the monster and crushed it, leaving no trace of it. Evil and her father were showered with a stream of dust and small stones, but overall they were completely unharmed. However, she was surprised to see a colossal mammoth that was known as Lord Mammoth. He was so huge that his carcass covered the sun. And somewhere high up in the clouds on its head was an ancient temple, ruled by an immortal toad with scrolls scattered around him. But even the toad was not the top of this pyramid. It mentally addressed its elder brother and reported to him that the danger had been destroyed, but the question remained what to do with these two harmless humans. There was a small house on his head. And guess who was in it? Not some twisted hermit, and not Naruto at all. It was Wan Kai. Turns out he was the one who was running this living pyramid, and he told the immortal toad that there was no need to harm these harmless humans. He would take them to his master to deal with them. Evil finally came to her senses. She thought she was having some kind of horrible nightmare because she jumped out of bed and shrieked, "Monster! But when she opened her eyes and looked around, there was no monster and no one at all. She was alone in the middle of an unusual row. The first thing she thought about was where her father was and what a strange place this was. She didn't remember how she got here. However, she remembered something else, and it terrified her. Her father was badly injured, and if he didn't get the treatment he needed in time, he would surely die. She mentally asked him to hang in there. She immediately jumped out of bed and ran towards the exit of the house. She opened the door and saw her father and screamed, "Dad!" As it turned out, it was not at all what she expected to see, and a mixture of incomprehension and shame reflected on her face. Her father was the healthiest of the healthy and posed, showing off his muscles and pumped-up body in the morning sunlight. Li Ping was simply delighted and clapped his hands at this, and complimented him that he must have spent a lot of time practicing to look like that. He answered him that as a fitness warrior it was fundamental to him. Only Elizabeth stood aside and didn't seem to share their enthusiasm at all. Li Ping asked if it was really a warrior profession from another world, because it was so cool. Meanwhile, Wang Kai carelessly ran around his master's feet and was happy to please him. But his behavior infuriated Elizabeth, and when she had had enough she kicked the poor dog with force. And he galloped across the field like a pebble on water. Elizabeth had some very nice indoor slippers that did absolutely nothing to stop her from kicking the poor dog very hard. Then she walked up to the frightened dog and angrily asked, "Who told you to bring this riffraff back, you stupid dog?" Wang Kai was upset from such blows and complaints and trembled under Elizabeth's fierce gaze, like a real dog that had wronged its mistress. Li Ping still couldn't admire the warrior's muscles and even went over to touch them. After one touch, he howled in delight, noticing how strong his muscles were. The old warrior was flattered by such attention and admiration, and decided that since Mr. Li Ping liked his body, he would not hide it. And the next moment, he went into 100% battle soul burning mode and his muscles swelled even more, tearing his clothes. And now he was posing in just his underwear in front of Li, whose eyes were burning with excitement, and he was vigorously cheering the performance. Evil finally came to her senses after what she had seen and moved closer. She had one question for her father: what was he doing? He finally noticed her and asked in surprise, "Evil, you finally woke up." To himself he replied that he was just trying to please his saviors. Li, too, couldn't find a way to properly explain what they were doing here, though it was probably impossible in principle. However, the awkward situation, if I may say so, was saved by Elizabeth, who interrupted their conversation and told Evil that since she was awake, it was time for them to get out of here. And moving dangerously close to the frightened girl, she added that she was warning her. She demonstrated her superiority in all areas, if you know what I mean, and said she was the first to arrive, unmistakably implying that she would not tolerate competition. Li tried to ease the tension between the girls and intervened in their conversation. He told Evil that they rarely had guests over, so he invited them to go to the house and continue their conversation there. After inviting the guests into the house, he made them each a cup of tea and invited them to help themselves. He was really sorry that now he had nothing good to offer them in this rural area, only this barley tea that he had made himself. Evil looked at the cup of tea as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world and asked her father if this was the miracle potion he had spoken of that would immediately heal whoever drank it. Upon hearing her words, Li laughed awkwardly, assuring them that it was an exaggeration, and he then simply gave them some cold water from the well. Elizabeth was sitting next to him, not liking what was going on at all, drinking her cocktail and not at all embarrassed to show her displeasure. She wondered what evil experiment Li Ping had brought these two weak people here for and what he wanted to do with them. Could it damn well mean she alone no longer satisfied him? The old warrior started to make excuses, that he was already unconscious back then before that time and could barely remember the details. And it was like this: Li Ping was working in the field as always and was absolutely happy about it. On such a peaceful and quiet day, there was no sign of trouble. But his calm work was interrupted by Wang Kai, who brought two unconscious people. Li had to do something to help them, but he had only water from the well he had brought with him, so he decided to at least give water to the wounded strangers. As soon as he gave the old man water, he became incredibly strong and his wounds were healed. And now he sat here in his room alive and well and told his daughter that if it had not been for Mr. Li Ping's help, he would probably never have seen her again. She looked at the cup of tea in fascination and asked if they could really drink such a precious thing. Li was really happy that he could help people like that. He replied to them that they adventurous people talked to him so nicely, although in reality they had absolutely no need to be so polite. They thanked him anyway and started drinking their tea. But as soon as they took the first sip, their eyes widened at what they felt. Incredible power and energy filled their bodies and even shone outward through their mouths and eyes. They felt everything that Elizabeth had once felt, and it changed her. They felt as if they had been transported to another world, a perfect world for them, where a stand of birds soared above them in the light of the setting sun. It seemed that they were in a human paradise, in white robes in the middle of a field of golden wheat. Happiness and positive emotions overwhelmed them. And tears of joy flowed from their eyes, which could not believe what they saw before them. The old man, who had seen many sorrows and joys in his relatively long life, but had never felt anything like this before, was especially weeping. The flock of birds that circled above them consisted of eagle-like birds, and they majestically and leisurely made circle after circle. The father and daughter just lay on the field and looked up into the beautiful sky, unable to believe that a human being could experience such bliss. They could not see it, but around them on that field there was drawn a mystical sign, definitely not of earthly origin. What's this about aliens anyway? Write your theories in the comments. While their souls were flying somewhere in the clouds of pleasure, their mortal bodies got a significant increase in power, and the old man became an archmage of the 4th level, and evil from a mage of the 1st level became an archmage of the 1st level. When they finally woke up, the old man told his daughter that he felt their magical skill levels had improved and advanced further than ever. Evil replied that not only had that happened, she had even awakened her mother's elf bloodline and had grown elven pointy ears. They sighed tiredly together. After crossing the boundaries of consciousness that tea had opened for them, nothing really mattered to them now. Such a change in their mood strained Lee a little. But he noticed their empty cups and happily offered to pour them another cup of his signature tea. Touched to the core by his kindness and the incredible tea, the old man said with tears of joy in his eyes that they had enough, really enough, and could not abuse his kindness any further. The real reason for his refusal was that he really thought Li Ping was a godly person, and was not sure if they could endure another such journey across the boundaries of their minds. Meanwhile, Li sadly agreed, since they didn't want to, and thought that he would really like to serve them drinks and snacks, but Elizabeth had taken and eaten them all, and if he tried to bring any more, it might anger the Demon Queen. He didn't think so for nothing, for Elizabeth was sitting next to him, sipping her cocktail and thinking that everything except this tea, which she didn't like, belonged exclusively to her, and the others shouldn't even think or dream about it. Lee apologized to the guests because of the fact that he couldn't offer them anything else. But that was absolutely not the reason they were upset. Lee, in order to defuse the atmosphere a little and to get to know his guests better, asked an old man, whose name was Barris, how and why they were attacked. Barris, remembering all the details, tensely answered that as he probably knows himself, it all happened because of the elven blood in Evil's body. Evil did not stay out of the conversation and added that her mother was one of the saintness of the elven race, and she gave birth to her after falling in love with her father, who was a human. But the laws of the elven race forbid intermarriage with other races. Lee was surprised to hear this and asked, what then is it that the elves were trying to catch them? But his question was interrupted by Elizabeth, who finished her cocktail and said that it was all nonsense, because the ban on intermarriage between races was cancelled many years ago after the Demon Queen united the whole world. Barris sighed heavily and replied that it was a long story. After Evil's mother was forced to return to the Elf Holy Land, he took Evil with him and hid her from everyone. His words reminded Lee of a story from his home world, Romeo and Juliet. And he still thought that it was the elves who had learned of Evil's existence and sent hunters to catch them. But Barris waved his hands in denial and continued that because of his wife's sacrifice and the fact that she had agreed to return to her people, the elves had decided to leave them alone and spare them. Those who were after them this time were envoys of the Dark Guild from the Demon Realm. Hearing his words, Lee looked suspiciously at Elizabeth and asked, Demon Realm, Dark Guild, what could that mean? The second cocktail was not enough to cool the demon queen's anger. So she jumped up from the bed and angrily poked him with her finger and asked him what he meant when he said that. Lee, realizing how screwed up he was, desperately started begging her for forgiveness. And surprisingly it worked, and Elizabeth calmly though resentfully sat down on the couch, showing her displeasure with her posture. She asked Barris to explain to her clearly where the Dark Guild came from in the demon dimension and why they were taking over the elves. Barris, with a look of horror on his face, answered her that they say that the Dark Guild is conducting mysterious and mystical human experiments whose purpose is to resurrect the demon queen who once united the whole world and whose name was Elizabeth. Evil added that the elves are just one of the materials they use so intensely that even she, who has yet to awaken her elf bloodline, has become their target. Lee and Elizabeth froze in their seats for a moment, not knowing what to answer. But then suddenly Elizabeth jumped up from her seat and grabbed Lee and began to shake him like a rag doll. She warned him not to even think that she didn't know what he was thinking. Poor Lee had to ask her for the second time that evening to calm down and forgive him, but this time he had no idea why. The guests watched the scene and Evil had no idea what they were talking about, but her father told her to shut up and mind her own business. Elizabeth was satisfied with her unconditional dominance over Lee, so she calmed down a bit and turned to the guests. She asked them what earth-shattering changes could have taken place outside in just 1 year. And who told them that the demon queen was dead. Barris was surprised at such an answer, and replied wasn't that so. After all, the demon queen Elizabeth had disappeared and had not appeared for over 500 years. If she were alive, she would have returned long ago to rule the world. Hearing this, Lee began to bite his nails with worry. He couldn't believe that 500 years had passed outside while Elizabeth had only lived here for a little over a year. However, little things like time and hundreds of years seemed to be of absolutely no concern to Elizabeth, who continued to sit quietly on the sofa. The only significance to her was, what were the rumors about her death and how did she die? Evil answered that according to ancient literature, the demon queen Elizabeth was killed by a legendary hero. But she was interrupted by her father and went on to say for her that legends say that the battle lasted for a month until the legendary hero sacrificed himself to protect the continent of heroes and died with the demon queen. When Elizabeth heard this, her eyes flashed with rage and she looked at them with a murderous look and asked them how dare they. The fire in her eyes was no ordinary fire, it was a powerful illusion that anyone who looked into them would fall into. And father and daughter made that mistake. They thought they were on a mountain of skulls and blood, and the same landscape could be seen everywhere around them under the blood moon. They were very scared and didn't realize how they got here. Evil asked her father in a trembling voice, "What is this place?" Her father answered her in horror that it was no illusion at all, it was pure killing intent. But the illusion disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, and they again saw before them the displeased face of Elizabeth, who told them that all these rumors were not true. The realization of such a possibility made the unhappy guests stop everything they could, and they became more like cats frightened by a dog than human beings. They had not even allowed themselves to think that it could be so. Lee saw their confusion and confirmed with a smile that this was the case, because he was the legendary hero, at least that's what the system told him. Words are hard to describe the emotions that the guests were forced to endure. The news, one more terrible than the other, poured down on them non-stop. And they looked in horror at Elizabeth, who, at first glance, could not be said to have drowned the continent in blood and seized power alone. Lee continued to speak, but with a wary look at Elizabeth that it was her. "It's the demon queen Elizabeth." Lee even covered his eyes to avoid seeing what was going to happen next. With such news, the guests just went into a blackout from such information overload. They even started foaming from their mouths like rabid animals. Elizabeth, on the other hand, just made a disgruntled face, only she knows why. From her perspective, Lee had set this up on purpose and was now pointing his finger at her, urging the guests to mock her. After all, she was the demon queen in prison here, so laugh at her. She couldn't stand such humiliation made up in her own head, so she pounded on the table and startled everyone present. Told everyone she'd had enough. As she walked away under the uncomprehending stares of Lee and Barris, she told them lastly that she wasn't going to entertain them anymore. On the outside she seemed calm enough, though upset. But inside she was furious and even steam was coming out of her ears. She kept repeating to herself that that stinking and mean Li Ping had gotten a lot of nerve. And now she realized he had saved those people on purpose and only to humiliate her. He had gone too far and she would not forgive him. Immersed in her thoughts, she reached the door and closed it behind her with such force that the whole house shook and the whole wall was covered with cracks. As soon as she left the room, Barris breathed out in relief, thinking to himself that finally this monster in a cute guise was gone. He apologized to Lee for pestering him and bringing more trouble to his house, but he wondered what the legendary hero had in mind for the future. Especially their future. Lee himself had barely recovered from the news of 500 years and Elizabeth's extravaganza of leaving the room and was now holding his hands to his knees, rubbing with fear. He barely managed to squeeze out a reply that he didn't know anything about the future, but first of all they all needed to calm down. But the disturbing thoughts did not leave him. As it turned out, after Elizabeth had broken the time barrier, time here had become chaotic and not synchronized with the rest of the world as he had thought before. Perhaps it would take quite some time. He still couldn't believe that 500 years had passed outside. They spent the rest of dinner in silence and tension until Lee finally realized to send his guests to bed. It was past midnight and a bright month lit up the room through the window. The guests lay on their beds and tried to pretend they were asleep, but they weren't very good at it as they had too much to talk about. Father and daughter were whispering. Evil said that she hadn't expected and still couldn't believe that the truth about the events of 500 years ago would turn out to be so. How could a demon queen fall in love with a legendary hero, leave the whole world at her feet and hide from everyone? Just like they did themselves once upon a time. Her father also whispered back to her that they had no right to compare themselves to them. Mr. Li Ping said to calm down first, and that surely meant that he was pondering how to deal with them, whether to spare them or not. And he advised her not to talk nonsense. But Evil didn't calm down and kept asking, why then did Mr. Li Ping save and heal them if he was going to kill them? Even an old warrior like him, who had seen many things, didn't have an exact answer to such a complex question. But he assumed that just as Li had mundanely helped them make the breakthrough to the advanced stage of magic with his sacred tea and then nearly strangled them by offering a supplement. He thought that for beings of this level, they ordinary mortals were no more than ants, and whether they were spared or killed depended solely on their mood. Suddenly there was a thud of footsteps. It was Lee who had come to check on the sleeping guests. But in the midnight darkness he seemed like a maniac. And his next sentence did not sound as he intended. He asked why they were still awake and what were they doing so late. Poor Evil had tears in her eyes and started to say goodbye to her life. She thought it was the end and he came in a bad mood to deal with those annoying ants he was tired of playing with. And Lee's grin in the dark was really scary, like a villain's. However, when he came closer and the moonlight illuminated him, he was smiling in a friendly way and holding a deck of playing cards. He asked them if they wanted to play cards since they were awake anyway. Barris, who expected a lot, but definitely not this, in a nervous voice and stammering a bit, asked if he really wanted to play cards. It was just like that, and having lit a candle in the room, Lee began to explain them the rules, which they, as it turned out, did not know. They sat around the candle, and when Lee finished explaining, he asked if they understood everything and looked at his students carefully. Barris answered him with the same look and replied that it was roughly understood. Evil, remembering her father's words, concluded that this game was Mr. Li Ping's test for them, by the results of which he would decide whether to kill them or not. Therefore, she was as focused as possible to win. Lee saw the guest's readiness, and said okay then, he will start dealing the cards. Evil nervously swallowed the lump in her throat, as if she was deciding on some deadly trick. Then she asked in a trembling voice, Mr. Li Ping, may I dare to ask, what's the name of this game? She could see the ominous blue aura emanating from those cards with her elven vision, and it made her tense. Such a question surprised Lee, and he didn't even know what to say to her. He needed to come up with a name for the game, which in his world was called Fighting the Landlord, or Dodiju, so that they would understand and remember it. Such a difficult task stumped him for a few minutes. But he did come up with a name for the game and happily pounded his fist on his hand. He told them to call the game Dragon Fight. But such a name was not received at all as he expected and only frightened his guests, who were very familiar with dragons and their power. As it turned out, they were not alone in the room and Elizabeth was spying on them using her high-level magic concealment technique. She looked like a cute little ghost with wings, and it was also the first time she had heard of a game like Dragon Fight. She looked down at the players and couldn't figure out what that sneaky Lee was up to this time. Meanwhile, he was trying to explain the game, which was that two brave heroes, that is them, had to join forces to defeat the dragon. Who would be the hero and who would be the dragon depended on the cards they drew and on the strength of their set of cards. Then he asked them if they understood everything or should he repeat it again. The father and daughter looked at each other nervously and Barris replied that of course that was enough and this was a test for them. It seemed to them that Lee was really a sick maniac who had decided to play cards on their lives. And now with a sly smile said that he was about to deal them cards and reminded them to think things through well before choosing. The Reo Lee looked at his cards with a good-natured smile and advised them to hurry or he would take the best of them. Barris turned to his daughter and said, "Evil, there is no room for hesitation now and she should take her cards." Poor Evil had no choice but to agree. She reached out her hand to the cards, which she thought were surrounded by electric shocks. As soon as she touched the cards, she and her father were suddenly transported to another dimension where they were sitting in the middle of some huge dark lake, but not drowning in it. Barris looked around and didn't know how they could have traveled to another dimension so quickly. However, even stranger things were happening to Evil, who was forced to lean on the floor with her hands. She had spent all her magical power just picking her cards and was now barely hanging on. She realized that she couldn't go on any longer and needed a break. She turned to her father and told him that she was sorry to let him down, but she couldn't go on any longer. Barris, seeing his daughter's condition, reassured her that everything was fine and advised her to leave the rest for him. He would sort it out. Lee didn't notice how difficult the game was for his guests and was looking at his cards with fascination. He asked them if any of them wanted to be a dragon. He had a very nice set of cards in his hand, even though he didn't have many big cards in it. He also had big kings and small kings. It was not bad and he had a good chance of winning. The scared father and daughter turned down the offer to be a dragon. They looked at their cards and still couldn't figure out if their cards were strong or not. Lee looked at his cards and realized that if he could draw 1 4 and 2 aces from the deck, he could win and was ready to take the risk. He asked them again if they wanted to be a dragon and they shook their heads vigorously in the negative. Lee had no choice but to be a dragon in this game and he was fine with that. He warned them that he would not be polite. Then he reached out his hand and took the top 3 cards from the deck. He flipped them over and threw them into the middle of their makeshift circle. To his dismay, there wasn't what he wanted to see there. Lee looked at the cards with a sad face. What a disappointment. However, the guests completely misunderstood his emotions and were terrified to think that he might be beaming with displeasure at their performance. The game continued and Lee was about to play an 8. After his move, it was Barris' turn, who was pensively looking at his cards and pondering that if they successfully passed this difficult test, Mr. Li Ping would surely spare them, so they could not afford to give up. But as soon as he bit down on one card to play it, he felt something. It turns out that every time he played a card, it cost him his life force. That didn't stop him. He was determined, he thought, to survive at all costs and played the Jack card. His finger he used to hold the card before throwing it wrinkled like dried up. Evil was shocked at what happened to her father's finger. It seemed to have aged 40 years and belonged to a very old man. But Barris was a true warrior and was not going to give up so easily. He told his daughter that he was fine and could handle everything. Evil, seeing the desperate determination on her father's face, didn't dare to contradict him and agreed to give up in this round. Meanwhile, Lee looked at his cards and realized that he was not doing as well as he would like, and if he responded to Barris' move now, he would most likely be at a disadvantage. So he decided to fold as well. Barris was shocked at this turn of events. How could a legendary hero pass? He decided to interrogate if he really didn't want to answer. And Lee nonchalantly replied that he did. Barris was horrified by such a choice of the legendary hero. It seemed to him that he had finally realized Lee's intention. which was to purposely make him continue playing cards by absorbing his life force. He thought that in such a situation, the best solution for him would be to get rid of all his cards as fast as possible. So he played 8 cards at once, the combination of which was called Flying Dragon. Barris put these cards in front of Lee and confidently said that according to the rules, this combination of cards is called Flying Dragon. However, as soon as he played the cards, he realized with horror what the price was. He grabbed his foot and saw that the same thing had happened to it that had happened to his toe before. He now realized that the greater the power of the cards he played, the greater the price he paid for it. As it turned out, the combination, the Flying Dragon, was called that for a reason, for after the combination was played, a blue dragon of energy appeared above them. Evil and Barris almost lost their jaws and eyes in surprise when they saw the dragon. The dragon was truly intimidating and was preparing his attack by gathering a blob of energy in front of his mouth. Once it was ready, it shot a beam of energy directly at Lee. Evil and Barris were simply petrified with fear. Elizabeth's ghost, on the other hand, watched it all with indifference, not showing any emotion. The dragon after its attack began to disappear as suddenly as it had appeared. Barris was horrified. He didn't know it would turn out like this. As it turned out, the fact that he played a combination of cards led him to a losing situation, not in the game, but in life. And now he is doomed, because he just offended the legendary hero and now he is sure to die. But Lee didn't seem to notice the dragon's attack, and the blue flame that was still burning on him didn't seem to bring him any discomfort either. He continued to study his cards intently, and then finally said that it was well played. Barris was confused and didn't realize whether to rejoice or cry, but just in case he suggested that Lee start the next round. But Lee replied with a smile that he didn't want to, and exactly the same suggestion was made to Barris. He realized that it was pointless to resist and agreed to start and began to look at his cards tensely. Then he played a 3 of spades, for which he immediately paid with another finger. Evil, as always before, passed and now. Lee said that his turn now played a 10. As it turned out, his opponents had nothing to answer. He was just waiting for this, and a smug smile played on his face. He went on and played straight. They were all immediately surrounded together by streams of energy forming a circle around them. A large wave appeared and immediately rushed towards them. Barris only had time to scream in fear when a wave called Sky-Destroying Wave came over them. The wave hit them, nearly washing them away, and Barris shouted to his daughter to hold on. But there was so much water that it covered them and they began to sink, gasping for air. When it seemed to them that everything and now they were going to drown, the water suddenly disappeared and they began to breathe convulsively, greedily grabbing air with their mouths. Evil exclaimed that she couldn't play this anymore. Lee seemed not to notice the despair of his guests and continued to play as if nothing had happened. Next he played 3 of a kind with a pair, and he was immediately surrounded by streams of blue energy. But this time the attack was different, not a dragon or a wave. It was a battle chariot that was already on its way to attack. Barris could not respond in any way and was already preparing for another beating, but then Evil intervened and asked to wait. She was determined to help her father, and now she had the right cards to do so. Her father asked her not to do it because she would then have to pay for drawing the cards with her life force. But that didn't stop her, and she replied that she couldn't hide behind his back forever, and now it was her time to protect him. She also, like Lee, played 3 of a kind with a pair. But because of her elven blood, she didn't age like her father. Instead, she spent her magical power. And now 2 chariots appeared above them and with a fierce shout rushed one upon the other. In the next moment the chariots collided and there was an explosion in the place of their collision, coloring everything around in turquoise tones. But as soon as the smoke from the explosion cleared, Lee's chariot came out of there unharmed, shining with a bright turquoise light. Barris and Evil froze, unable to believe what had happened. When they came to their senses, Barris immediately turned to his daughter and asked if she was all right. She frowned her eyebrows at the protagonist and told her father in a firm voice that she was fine. Lee, with a smile on his face, turned to the father and daughter and said that even if they lost their cards at the right moment, they still had to protect their teammates, also adding that the most important thing was their determination and teamwork. At the same time, he thought to himself in surprise that he didn't expect that they would understand the essence of this game of cards so quickly and would even be able to impose a good competition on him. Barris heard his words about determination and looked questioningly at his hand with two dried-up fingers. He wondered what he really meant. But then Lee suddenly looked at his cards, solemnly announced that it was all just too late. He was absolutely sure of his victory. Evil and Barris didn't understand what was going on and looked at him in despair. Even Elizabeth realized that something was about to happen, and she had a bad and ominous feeling about the whole thing. Lee pulled out two of his cards, and with a smug smile placed two jokers on the floor at once. Immediately afterward, the ceiling above them shone with a blue light and a huge crack appeared. The father watched in horror, not knowing what kind of terrible creature would appear from there. From the crack appeared large hands with long claws, which began to widen the crack, until finally a hideous-looking jester or clown with bells on his hat could squeeze in and with his toothy smile scared the hell out of Evil and Barris. And even Elizabeth was shocked by the creature that Lee had summoned and the censorious words she lacked to express her emotions. As it turned out, it was a Supreme Clown King who was also a 3-star demon level, and he was already reaching out his clawed hand to the frightened victims. But suddenly, he stopped and summoned the cute heart. However, he never did anything with it since it got his attention. On the other hand, he looked directly at Elizabeth and asked what she was staring at. After a moment he turned the heart in his hands into a knife. And turning to Elizabeth he advised her to be careful as he might just kill her. He licked his knife viciously and bloodily to confirm his words. She was furious and asked him who he thought he was looking at. She was preparing a spell to show him who he was messing with. She, being a demon queen, had already lost her honor by losing once and had taken the humiliation of being imprisoned for over a year for a hero to feed her. All this to barely reach the level of a 3-star demon god. Now she couldn't believe that the legendary hero had so easily and casually summoned a rival equal to her in a game with mere mortals. Meanwhile, father and daughter had already come to terms with their fate, and Barris begged forgiveness in his daughter for being powerless. She sadly answered him that he could not blame himself, for it was all her fault. She herself had annoyed Mr. Li Ping. But suddenly Barris coughed up blood and was horrified to feel the life force draining out of him at a maddening pace. Hardening himself, he placed his cards on the floor without even realizing what he was doing. Lee finally noticed the distress of his guests and asked if they were all right. He figured it was all because their injuries from the demon attack still hadn't healed. Then he looked down at the cards that Barris had placed. It seemed to Lee that Barris could have won a lot of time ago and was just letting him play with it. Now he seemed so naive and stupid to himself for thinking he was good at this game. What really just disturbed the rest of his guests. With such sad thoughts, he began to pick up the cards scattered on the floor. And his horrible summoned clown immediately vaporized. Lee gathered all the cards back into the deck, and stood up and thanked the guests for the game and the fun and advised them to get a good night's rest. And frustrated, he headed out of the room apologizing for the inconvenience. The father and daughter were really surprised and puzzled. They couldn't believe that they were still alive. And now they knew for sure that this legendary hero would be very difficult indeed for them to understand him, if at all possible. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had her own worries. She was furious. How outrageous it was to her that even playing cards with these two people, the legendary hero's real plan was to find an opportunity to attack the Demon Queen. The next morning the guests wished to go on their way without any delay and without breakfast. Lee thought this strange, and asked them if they would like to stay a couple of days longer, for the fruit he had planted was almost ripe, and he planned to give them a banquet. But Barris bowed to him in return and said that they could not occupy the two of them any longer. And Lee's kindness and favor would never be forgotten by them. Lee was surprised at such gratitude and asked them not to make things so serious. Before leaving, Barris assured them that after they left they would keep their secret and absolutely wouldn't say anything to anyone. Evil asked if Lee really wanted to give them such a valuable gift. She had a white tea box in her hands. But Lee cheerfully assured them that it was just regular barley tea and he would really like them to take it with them. As it turned out, the gifts didn't end there and Lee put something else in Bear's hand, saying that it would be a memento of him to them. It was the deck of cards they had played with last night. Bears was surprised at such a valuable and dangerous gift. Horrible memories of last night flew before his eyes. But Lee had insisted and asked him to take them. For as it turned out, his card-playing skills were too bad and they were totally unsuitable for him. But his self-abuse was interrupted by the exclamation of Elizabeth, who had been standing nearby all this time. Bears heard her voice and was startled. Elizabeth told them to hurry up and get out of here. This seemingly short phrase had a lightning effect, and in a moment the guests were left with only a streak of dust, which they raised, fleeing at top speed away. Lee didn't even have time to say goodbye to them. He stared at them questioningly, not realizing what had happened. As soon as the guests disappeared over the horizon, Elizabeth turned around and went into the house, saying that now that everything was back to normal, Lee should go and cook a lot of food for his queen. The poor man had no choice but to agree. Bears was desperately dragging Evil by the arm, eager to get away from that cursed place where the two super creatures were playing their strange games. Poor Evil got dizzy from running so fast and asked her father to stop for a moment, because she couldn't take it anymore. Bears himself was tired and finally slowed down sharply. He tried to catch his breath, and he could hardly do it after such an intense run. Still trying to catch his breath, he remembered the events of last night, the worst night of his life, first the test in the form of a game from a legendary hero, and then the threats from the Demon Queen. The memories of last night flashed before his eyes, when right after the legendary hero had left them to rest, Elizabeth appeared to them in all her glory. Without saying anything and looking at them with a murderous stare from which they could not move, she made a sharp movement with her hand, as if she wanted to cut something off. And she drew her hand straight across the neck of the guests, and in the darkness it seemed that this red line cut off their heads. The father and daughter immediately grabbed their throats, trying to breathe while their necks burned with fire. They were unharmed, but they were wearing seals, in an unknown language that looked like thin collars. Immediately after that, Elizabeth addressed them in a threatening tone and ordered them to leave this place tomorrow, and they were obliged not to reveal any information about her, that is, the Demon Queen and the legendary hero, especially about their presence in this world. It was an order that could not be disobeyed. And Beres, with a pathetic look, answered for both of them that they understood everything and they would not dare to disobey Her Majesty's order. But for Elizabeth their words were not enough, and she told them that if they had even the slightest idea of going against her will, the accursed seal around their necks would immediately behead them. Returning from his memories, Beres concluded that the truth of the whole story was that the Demon Queen who ruled the entire world and the legendary hero Li Ping were tired of the worldwide conflict between good and evil and now didn't want anyone to bother them. As he spoke, Evil looked around and noticed that the place looked familiar. Beres didn't believe her at first and wrapped his own head around it. And then, seeing the huge footprints and demon prints, he asked in surprise if he had run this far. It was exactly where they had fought their pursuers last time. Watching them from far away was Wang Kai, who thought that sending them here should stop them from pestering the master and that fierce woman forever. It turns out that it wasn't actually Beres who was running so fast out of fear, but Wang Kai was helping him a lot, in a way that he didn't even realize. Evil and Beres stood in front of the giant mammoth's footprints and saw the corpses of the Dark Guild apostles that were still here. Beres sensed with one spot that there was something wrong here and there might be high-level demons nearby, so they needed to leave this place as quickly as possible. Wang Kai also sensed that something was approaching. But he was in absolutely no mood to help them again, so he opened the portal and thought that no one cared what happened to them, so he would rather go back home and get beaten up by that fierce woman. And he immediately jumped into this portal, leaving no trace behind. Meanwhile, Evil and Beres were already surrounded by many dark cloaked figures. But this time there was one demon who stood out among them, and now he was laughing gloatingly while the other low-ranked demons were making incomprehensible noises, either laughing or just intimidating their victims. Beres was horrified to recognize that demon as the Great Apostle. It was the first time Evil had heard of him and did not fully understand the danger they were in. The great apostle of the Dark Guild continued to laugh and pointed his finger directly at the two victims in front of him. Immediately, a multitude of high-level spirit demons rushed to attack. The father and daughter were very frightened, for the difference in their strength and levels was very significant. Evil realized that they had no chance in the battle and suggested to her father to run and she would stay and buy him time. But he had a plan to solve everything, for despite the large gap in their strength, now after seeing the measurement of the strength of those two, all those apostles seemed nothing in comparison. Marries took out a deck of cards from which streams of blue energy began to emanate and announced to everyone that now everyone would call him the hero with a heart of iron. The streams of energy from the deck threw back the attacking apostles. The great apostle did not expect such resistance. Marries, feeling the power in his hands, told Evil that ever since her mother had returned to her elven tribe, he had taken complete care of her and had become very timid so as not to attract unnecessary attention. But now he knew he was wrong and just running away wouldn't solve the problem, and now with this power, if they survived and got through this difficulty, he would take Evil to the elven tribe and take her mother back to reunite their family. Next he squeezed the deck of cards in his hands harder. And 4 cards flew out of it, surrounded by green energy. It was a summoning card. This combination of cards allowed him to use a technique called 4 Bombs of God Arrow Indulgence. The majestic image of Evil's mother appeared above him. And she, unable to believe her eyes, could not take her gaze off of her. Marries gathered all the energy in front of him and shouted that now he would play his card. The image of Evil's mother caught a bundle of green energy and formed it into a bow and arrow. The arrow flew at an incredible speed, slicing through the air with a whoosh. One of the demons only had time to shriek. In the next instant, the arrow began to pierce through the demons' heads one by one. It didn't fly just straight, but zigzagged, leaving no chance for the demons to dodge. When the last demon spirit was defeated, the arrow flew straight at their leader, the great apostle, who did not even make an attempt to dodge, confident in his strength and invulnerability. As the arrow flew toward him, he stopped it with one hand with a smug smile. But when he felt its power, his smile immediately changed to a nervous one. He immediately tried to hold the arrow with both hands, chafing and chuckling in panic. But he never managed to contain that power, and the arrow pierced the head of the last enemy on the battlefield. Marries carefully stacked the cards back into the deck. The image of his wife began to feed with them. Finally he could relax a little, and immediately his strength failed him and he fell to his knee. His daughter immediately ran up to him. After a little breathing, he said that it looked like he should change his profession. Father and daughter sat in the middle of the field near the ditch that the arrow had left behind. The power of this attack was incredible, and at the same time, it didn't require boundless strength from the one who used it. Just like that, from that moment onwards, a new profession called Card Master appeared on the hero continent. A week later, Lee was sitting in the shade of a tree near his house, enjoying the fruits of his labor. On the table in front of him were sliced watermelon slices. As he ate the delicious watermelon, he thought about how wonderful the magical world was. Almost anything was possible here, and even his personal method of plant crossbreeding was successful. He was able to grow many different fruits and berries on one plant. But he was missing something, because without the opportunity to share the results of his labor and harvest, he felt empty, and that something was missing. In this world he had the opportunity to become anything he wanted, a warrior, an archer, a mage, even a servant of the demon queen, but he chose to remain an ordinary farmer in the village of newcomers. And up until this point, it had seemed to him from the beginning that he would always be satisfied with peaceful farming. But now that he had everything and had some contact with the outside world through guests, his heart couldn't find peace. Now he wanted to see that outside world. Lee sighed, realizing that all people are like that and he is no different from them. When they get something they then immediately want 2 more, and so on. Unfortunately, he couldn't go to the outside world as he was too weak, so he should forget about it. Suddenly, a small pop occurred near him. When the smoke from it cleared, there was Elizabeth, who teleported here from the house without getting up from her chair. She asked our hero what was on his mind. After all, he had been looking rather sad lately. Lee replied that he would like to go out into the outside world, but he was too weak to do so. Elizabeth laughed at his words and remarked that he was finally anxious to leave this place. Well, she could help him and he could travel with her. She thought to herself that the outside world was simply not comparable to his world, and his attempt to make himself a defenseless victim was too arrogant. Lee glowed with happiness. He couldn't believe she was offering to help him. He thought that with the Demon Queen and her protection it would be a completely different story and he would be safe. Elizabeth responded to all this by finishing her cocktail and advised him to cut the crap and go change. 10 minutes later they were already fully prepared for their trip. Lee finally changed his work attire and now he did not look like a peasant from a distant village. Elizabeth had also dressed up, all the clothes Lee had made for herself in him. And now the Demon Queen was forced to notice that his cooking and sewing skills were very impressive. They stood together admiring their new look. Lee replied that it was indeed true, as those were his main specialties, cooking and sewing. Watching this sweet couple, even Wan Kai barked with delight. Elizabeth snapped her fingers. Immediately, a portal called Transfer Door appeared in front of them. Elizabeth explained that by going through it they could get to the nearest town. Lee was surprised and remarked what a handy skill this was. Elizabeth was not going to hesitate and headed for the portal. But Lee stopped her, asking her to wait and answer a few questions. He was a little scared to ask them, but he still dared to. He wanted to know for sure that once they got to the outside world, would Elizabeth leave him alone? Would she be able to keep her emotions in check? And could she not use her power to its fullest? But as always, Elizabeth understood everything in her own way, and it seemed to her that these were not questions but orders for her, in which he forbade her to leave him without permission, ordered her to control her temper and not to use magic carelessly so as not to spoil his fun of socializing with ordinary people. She replied with a stony face that she understood. But that was not the end of his questions, and the main question that bothered him was, would she come back here with him when she saw the changes outside? Lee was very worried that now that the protective barrier of the newcomer village was gone without the protection of the Demon Queen, it would very quickly become food for the demonic creatures that were prowling around. Elizabeth replied that of course she would come back here. She thought to herself that before she officially defeats this evil legendary hero, the outside world means nothing to her. Lee was glad to hear such good news. But Elizabeth had conditions too. He had to agree to just one request of hers. Lee asked fearfully what was the request, imagining what she might want in return. She stepped closer to him and asked that when they returned he have something ready for her. A super deluxe assorted fruit pudding. Lee interjected in surprise, pudding. Elizabeth confirmed that was exactly what it was and asked if he had any problem with that. An overjoyed Lee replied that of course not, go ahead. And they walked through the portal together, leaving poor Wang Kai alone. He only had time to bark goodbye to them. It was Lee's first trip through the portal, and it wasn't the most pleasant, but it was fast. He squinted at the bright light. Then he looked around in surprise. There was a beautiful and colorful medieval city with a large castle in the center. It was a neutral town on the outskirts of the continent of heroes. It was called Boaster, and from afar it looked peaceful and prosperous. At first glance, it looked like humans and monsters were living peacefully side by side. Lee glowed with happiness and marveled at how amazing this place was, as if he had stepped into another world. Elizabeth didn't share his admiration and just looked around. First Lee noticed the gear store with helmets, shields and armor. Then to a butcher's shop selling ingredients, but what surprised him it was the carcass of an ordinary pig on the counter. So he bounced from one store to another, each time marveling at everything like a little child. Elizabeth stood motionless in the middle of the market and noticed that 500 years had passed quite unnoticed, and the changes in the outside world did not seem so significant. After the market they went on to look around the city, and Lee said that it seemed to him that the world around them was not as chaotic as Uncle Bears had told them. Elizabeth closed her eyes with a smug smile and said that it was all thanks to her, for she had laid a strong foundation during her reign. In the beginning in this world, various forces were in conflict and the situation was chaotic. But thanks to the fact that she used her absolute power to suppress them all, she managed to establish a set of rules where absolutely everyone was equal. So it was her who saved the world, not Lee, the so-called hero. After finishing her monologue, she finally opened her eyes and looked at the place where the hero should have been. But he wasn't there, which made Elizabeth very angry, and she clenched her fists. She thought it was nonsense that he didn't even pay attention to her past accomplishments and instead went to look at the counter with the dolls. Another humiliation for her from a legendary hero. Meanwhile, Lee was looking at the homemade dolls for sale, bunnies and bears. He especially liked the way they were made and asked the girl who was selling them if she had made them herself. The girl with the glasses replied that yes, and if he liked them so much, she could offer him a lower price than usual. But their sweet conversation was interrupted by the rude shouting of a boar man who asked who gave them permission to set up shop here. Then with a single kick of his foot he threw over the crate on which the toys were stacked, and they flew in all directions. The pig-headed bandit grabbed the poor girl by the arm and called her a stinker, adding that her church owed his gang protection money and had never paid. How dare she set up shop in his place after that? Apparently that Annie girl was the oldest among the orphans some church had taken care of, and she was selling homemade dolls to further provide for her younger siblings. Several of them were with her now and watched with horror and tears in their eyes the outrage of the bandit, who grabbed the girl by the scruff of the neck and lifted her above the ground. But even in this position, she boldly answered him that their gang had never protected them, so why should they pay them for protection? Such a statement made the bandit angry, and he called her an idiot, because since last month this whole street had become their territory and had come under the control of the Beast Gang. And now if she wanted to survive here, she would have to pay them a ransom every month. The girl desperately replied to him that none of this was true and the church belonged to the nun, not them. And when she returned, their gang would be in trouble. Lee watched everything in rage but did nothing about it yet. The boar man continued to threaten the girl by telling her that she was uneducated and didn't understand anything about the situation. For that he would so and so throw all the orphans away and raze that broken church to the ground. Lee finally couldn't stand it any longer and shouted at him to stop. The bandit, not believing his ears, turned to see who was so brave and stupid and asked him what he was going to do to stop him. Lee immediately lost his fervor and began to stammer, unable to say anything intelligible. Elizabeth looked at him askew and thought that he minded his own business. She did not understand why he wanted to play with these ordinary people again. But for Lee everything looked completely different, and he looked pleadingly at Elizabeth for help and support. She turned away from him proudly and unapproachably, unwilling to stoop to his level. Not getting a clear answer, the bandit began to get furious and repeated his question, asking what intentions our hero has. Lee in horror grabbed his head, not knowing what to do. But then he came up with a brilliant, as it seemed to him, idea. And he immediately decided to realize it. He pointed his finger at the bandit and loudly urged the whole crowd of citizens to come and condemn this pig-headed man for bullying a little girl. But as it turned out, no one wanted to help him and everyone pretended not to hear anything. Absolutely nothing was seen or heard. The bandit only laughed at his pathetic attempt and asked if he really thought anyone would come to his aid. Everyone on this street knew the Beast Gang, and no one wanted to mess with them. The pig-headed man looked suspiciously at the hero's clothes and made the assumption that he was a foreigner from the south. But then grinned nastily at the protagonist's companion and said she wasn't bad. Frightenedly offered to discuss everything. After all, he has several valuable items of his own production in his backpack, and he could share with them. But this arrangement did not suit the bandits, who appeared from the crowd and now approached the protagonist. The pig-headed man ordered them to undercut all their goods, beat the insolent man, and seize the woman and drag her to their lair and lock her up there. Elizabeth, though she was in Lee's imaginary captivity, but now she asked the approaching bandits with a cocky smile if they really thought there was anyone capable of imprisoning her in a dungeon. So they were really stepping on the tail of the tiger. Just then, pink clouds with lightning bolts covered the sky over the town and Elizabeth's evil smile appeared in the sky. The bandits were frightened and did not understand why the weather had changed so dramatically. And not only them, all the townspeople were terrified of what was happening in the sky. They all wondered what or who could have caused Armageddon on their heads so suddenly. Lee asked Elizabeth not to do that, not to destroy the whole town. He tried to calm her down as much as he could and asked her to calm down because she had scared them enough already. She doesn't really want to fight ordinary people, does she? Finally, Elizabeth exhaled and replied that okay, she would spare them all, but only because he asked. Elizabeth's magical power was immense compared to the rest of the residents, and this was noticed by the orphan girl Annie, who seemed to have her own unique abilities. She could see what the others couldn't and was surprised to see such power. Meanwhile, the bandits noticed that the clouds were beginning to part and wondered if it would finally rain today or not.